Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the curious world of medieval banquets, where one unlikely creature often graced the feast tables, the humble dormouse. Imagine yourself sitting among the flickering candlelight, the clinking of goblets and soft murmurs of nobles swirling around you as a platter arrives, not piled high with roast beef or steaming pies, but with a collection of tiny, plump dormice. Yes, those small, furry critters you probably only associate with woodland scurrying suddenly become the centerpiece of extravagant feasts. You probably won't survive this if you're a modern-day foodie easily thrown by the idea of nibbling on rodents. But medieval diners clearly had a different palate. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's always fun to know who's joining this slow journey through history. From where in the world? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the medieval era, banquets weren't just about filling your belly. They were performances of status, culture, and taste. Dormice featured prominently in the scene, especially in England and parts of Europe. These small rodents were considered a delicacy, prized for their tender meat and novelty. Unlike today's more common game meats like venison or wild boar, dormice were tiny, requiring specialized preparation and presentation. They often appeared roasted, sometimes stuffed with nuts or spices, and served as part of a multi-course meal designed to impress guests with both abundance and exotic flavors. Historians still argue whether dormice became popular purely due to their flavor or because of their symbolism. Their rarity made them a luxury, and luxury defined nobility. Serving dormice was a statement. You had the means and connections to source and prepare these little morsels. Medieval cookbooks, like the famed Forme of Cury from 14th century England, include recipes for dormouse dishes, demonstrating their culinary significance. But their presence on the table wasn't only about taste. It was about telling a story of refinement and privilege. What might seem bizarre today was an entirely different kind of indulgence back then. The banquets themselves were slow-paced, long affairs where guests lingered over food, wine, and conversation. The gentle roasting aroma of dormice mingled with the flickering shadows cast by iron chandeliers, creating a sensory backdrop to a world that valued ritual and spectacle as much as the food itself. So, as you settle in with this vision, try to imagine not just the taste, but the atmosphere, the hushed excitement when the platter arrives, the careful passing of the dish, and the polite nods exchanged over a shared appreciation of a meal that would be strange to modern sensibilities. It's a quiet window into a time when even a tiny dormouse carried a weight of meaning far beyond its size. You find yourself stepping softly into the quiet forests and hedgerows, where dormice make their homes, far from the bustling halls of medieval banquets. These little creatures, with their round eyes and bushy tails, live mostly out of sight, nestled among dense shrubs and tree branches. They're nocturnal by nature, shuffling through the undergrowth in search of nuts, berries, and seeds. The common edible dormouse, Gliss gliss, is native to Europe and is surprisingly good at hiding from predators, except when humans have other plans. Dormice are small, only about the size of a modern rat but fluffier, with soft fur that can range from gray to brown. Their biology makes them interesting. They hibernate for up to 6 months, curled up in tight balls, slowing their heart rate and metabolism almost to a stop. This ability to hibernate wasn't just fascinating. It made dormice ideal for medieval farmers who wanted to fatten them over time without constant feeding, since they would essentially pause during winter. More on that later. Their habitats were typically deciduous woodlands and hedgerows, patchworks of wild growth surrounding villages and towns. These areas were crucial for medieval people, offering a bounty of wild food and materials. Dormice were one such natural resource, relatively easy to catch compared to larger game. Farmers and villagers would set traps along known dormouse pathways or in trees laden with their favorite food. Interestingly, dormice have a natural diet that includes hazelnuts and acorns, which contributes to their sweet, nutty flavor, a fact that medieval cooks exploited. You can almost imagine the subtle crunch and soft meat, not unlike a delicate game bird. Historians still argue whether the appeal was primarily taste or novelty, but either way, dormice were an ecological oddity turned culinary treasure. A quirky detail you might not expect is how dormice's hibernation cycle affected medieval hunting and farming. Because dormice could be caught before or after hibernation, their fat content varied wildly. Dormice caught after a long winter were plump and prized for their tenderness, making them perfect for feasts timed with the seasons. You can almost picture a medieval villager climbing a ladder to a tree, gently shaking a hazel branch to rouse these sleepy creatures from their nests, or setting clever traps baited with nuts, waiting patiently for the tiny harvest to come home. Dormice were a unique form of small game farming before such a concept was widely known. The biology and behavior of dormice made them particularly suited for the slow, deliberate pace of medieval feasting culture. They were not only a food source, but a seasonal marker telling diners that winter had passed and the cycle of nature continued, a quiet celebration of survival itself. And so, as you picture these small animals scurrying through moss and leaf litter under a silver moon, you get a sense of their quiet importance, both to the forest and the feasts of faraway nobles. It's a gentle reminder that even the smallest creatures can leave a big mark on history's table. You find yourself in a humble medieval farmstead, stepping into a world where raising dormice wasn't just a quirky curiosity but an established practice blending patience, practicality, and a surprising tenderness. Unlike the wild hunts for deer or boar, dormouse farming involved intricate care and a slow rhythm of life, almost like nurturing tiny, furry livestock. The medieval farmers didn't just trap dormice, they raised them intentionally, using specialized enclosures called gliraria, wooden cages or pens designed to mimic the dormice's natural habitat while encouraging them to fatten up for the feast. These gliraria weren't mere cages, but carefully crafted wooden boxes, often rectangular or hexagonal, lined with straw or dried leaves to provide comfort. They were filled with favorite dormouse treats like hazelnuts, acorns, and berries, foods that were abundant in surrounding woodlands. You might imagine the gentle rustling sounds inside the cages as dormice shuffled, nibbled, and burrowed, cozy and unaware that their fate was sealed as the centerpiece of an upcoming banquet. The process was surprisingly detailed. Medieval agricultural texts and cookbooks provide instructions that suggest dormouse farming was more than a casual pastime. Farmers knew that dormice had to be kept warm and comfortable, especially during the cold months when they naturally hibernated. Instead of letting them sleep through winter, the gliraria allowed careful feeding and monitoring to ensure they gained the maximum amount of fat, turning their small bodies into tender, plump morsels. It's almost poetic, a tiny animal that hibernates to survive winter, instead being gently coaxed awake, encouraged to bulk up for a human feast. One charming practice was decorating these enclosures with fresh chestnut leaves or oak branches. This wasn't just for show. The leaves helped reduce stress, calming the dormice and encouraging them to eat more. You can almost picture a medieval farmer humming softly, perhaps while setting the last leaf in place, showing a surprising tenderness for these tiny creatures. It's an oddly sweet image, set against the often harsh backdrop of medieval life. Historians still argue whether dormouse farming was a widespread practice or mostly confined to wealthy estates and monastic communities. Monasteries, with their quiet routines and experimental spirit, likely perfected these methods, documenting them with care Some suggest that common folk might have trapped wild dormice occasionally, but lacked the resources or time to maintain gliraria. The debate touches on the larger question of how specialized and developed medieval animal husbandry really was, especially for such an unusual species. Interestingly, dormouse farming can be seen as an early form of animal husbandry, showing that medieval people were resourceful and inventive beyond just raising cattle, sheep, or pigs. It's a subtle glimpse into how humans have long tried to tame and shape nature's smallest creatures for their needs. This small-scale farming required patience, attention to detail, and a gentle hand, qualities not often associated with the medieval stereotype of brutality and hardship. Imagine the quiet routine. A farmer rising early, checking the gliraria, arranging fresh nuts and leaves, and perhaps even speaking softly to the tiny creatures. There's a rhythm here that connects with the slow, deliberate pace of medieval banquets themselves, where meals stretched over hours and every dish told a story. As you picture these little enclosures tucked in shaded corners of the farmstead, you get a sense of a world where even the smallest lives mattered in the grand scheme of survival and celebration. The dormouse, in its wooden home, becomes a symbol of patience, ingenuity, and the curious intimacy between humans and the natural world. So next time you think about medieval farming, don't just imagine fields of wheat or herds of cattle. Think also of the quiet care devoted to tiny dormice, preparing delicate treats for the grandest tables, a tiny creature woven deeply into the tapestry of history's feast. You're now seated in a dimly lit medieval kitchen, the air thick with the mingling scents of roasting meats, fresh herbs, and spices both familiar and exotic. Here, dormice receive their final transformation from small, furry creatures to tender dishes worthy of noble tables. The preparation of dormice was a process steeped in tradition, technique, and a touch of culinary flair that might surprise you. Dormice were typically roasted whole, often after being plucked and cleaned with care. Medieval recipes, like those found in the form of curry or later cookbooks, suggest they were sometimes stuffed with mixtures of nuts, honey, herbs, and spices, a precursor to modern stuffed meats. You can almost imagine a cook carefully sliding a tiny dormouse into a stuffing blend of crushed hazelnuts and fragrant herbs such as thyme or marjoram, then skewering it on a spit to roast over gentle embers. The taste, according to historical accounts, was described as delicate and subtly sweet, somewhat reminiscent of rabbit or a mild game bird. Dormice's natural diet of nuts and berries likely contributed to this flavor profile. A touch of honey or wine might be added during cooking to enhance the sweetness and tenderness, balancing the texture and giving the dish an almost luxurious quality. Some cooks even prepared dormice as pâtés or minced mixtures, combining the meat with almonds or breadcrumbs to create savory spreads served on crusty bread. This versatility made dormice a favorite, not only for their novelty, but also for the subtle complexity they brought to medieval menus. A quirky tidbit involves the way dormice were skewered and presented. Sometimes they were arranged on skewers to resemble small birds on a spit, a playful culinary illusion that delighted diners. This attention to presentation was part of the spectacle. Meals were as much about entertainment and showmanship as about sustenance. Historians still argue whether dormice recipes were regional specialties or found across much of medieval Europe. While England and parts of Italy left detailed records, other regions' evidence is patchier, suggesting some local variation in how dormice were prepared and enjoyed. It's fascinating to note that dormouse recipes persisted well into the Renaissance in some places, evolving with changing tastes, but never quite disappearing from the table. This slow culinary evolution reflects broader shifts in European dining habits and access to exotic ingredients. So, as you imagine the kitchen's warm glow, the crackling fire, and the careful hands turning skewers of tiny dormice, remember, this was more than a meal. It was a slow, sensory experience designed to comfort and impress, a gentle ritual in the long medieval evening. You're now moving beyond the kitchen and into the grand dining hall, where the Dormouse finally takes center stage among a feast's array of delicacies. The atmosphere here is both formal and convivial, with flickering candlelight reflecting off polished wooden tables and tapestries adorning stone walls. Banquets were social performances as much as they were meals, and serving dormice was a subtle way to showcase wealth, taste, and sometimes a touch of whimsy. Dormice were often presented as part of a multi-course meal, nestled alongside roasted birds, spiced pies, and jellies. They appeared on ornate platters, sometimes gilded or decorated with fresh herbs, and were carefully portioned for sharing among noble guests. The small size of dormice meant that they were usually served whole, each guest enjoying the novelty of this tiny morsel with a delicate fork or their fingers. One interesting detail is how dormice were paired with sweet and sour sauces or drizzled with honey, complementing their naturally mild flavor. This kind of flavor layering was typical in medieval cuisine, where combining sweet, sour, and savory notes created complex tastes that modern palates might find surprising. Imagine dipping a roasted dormouse into a tart fruit sauce, the contrasting flavors sparking a quiet delight among the diners. The social rituals surrounding dormouse consumption were also notable, because dormice were considered a delicacy. They were sometimes used as a form of polite gift exchange, or offered as a mark of respect to visiting dignitaries. Presenting dormice could symbolize hospitality and refinement, a gentle way to say you are esteemed here. Historians still argue whether dormice were consumed primarily by the aristocracy, or if wealthy merchants and guild members occasionally enjoyed them too. Some records hint at broader accessibility during special occasions, suggesting dormice were a treat reserved for festivals and celebrations rather than everyday fare. There's also evidence that dormice were sometimes kept live in ornate cages within the household, both as a food source and as curiosities. Little creatures that bridged the worlds of pet and pantry. This dual role reflects the medieval tendency to blend practical use with a certain fascination for the natural world. As you imagine the hall filled with laughter, soft conversation, and the gentle clinking of goblets, dormice quietly claim their place at the table, a tiny, tender emblem of medieval luxury and slow, deliberate enjoyment. You settle into the quieter moments after the feast, when the conversation drifts toward the curiosities and customs that made medieval dining so distinctive. Dormice, as tiny as they are, hold a surprising place in the social and symbolic fabric of the time. Beyond mere food, they carried meanings that ranged from status symbols to good luck charms. Details that help you understand the medieval mind's gentle mix of practicality and superstition. Dormice were sometimes associated with abundance and prosperity. In some regions, keeping dormice in cages was thought to bring good fortune, perhaps because their fattened bodies symbolized plenty and the successful harvest of the surrounding land. There are accounts of nobles gifting live dormice in decorated cages to friends or allies as tokens of goodwill, small creatures that embodied both nourishment and the promise of wealth. One quirky superstition involved a dormouse fat, which some believed had medicinal properties. It was occasionally used as a salve for ailments like earaches or joint pains. While modern science hasn't backed these claims, the belief highlights the overlap between food and medicine in medieval culture. Historians still argue how widespread such practices were, but it's clear dormice held a curious place in both the kitchen and the apothecary's cabinet. The symbolism of dormice extended into art and literature, too. Manuscripts and tapestries sometimes depicted dormice in scenes of feasting or as part of woodland imagery, emphasizing their role in nature's cycles and human celebration. These tiny creatures became subtle emblems of seasonal change, domestic comfort, and the slow rhythms of rural life. You might also find it intriguing that dormice were sometimes considered pets, especially among the nobility. Their small size and gentle nature made them ideal companions, and their presence in the household added a touch of whimsy and charm. It's a reminder that medieval people's relationships with animals were multifaceted, functional, but often affectionate. So, as you drift through these quieter reflections, dormice emerge, not just as food, but as symbols woven into the tapestry of medieval life. Small, soft creatures carrying layers of meaning beyond their modest size. The medieval world was full of such gentle contradictions, blending the earthy with the mystical in ways that invite you to slow down and appreciate the subtle details. You find yourself wandering into the realm of medieval medicine and health, where dormice again make a curious appearance. While their culinary role is well documented, their place in medicinal practices adds another layer to their strange historical legacy. The connection between food and healing was very fluid in the Middle Ages, with many foods thought to possess therapeutic powers, and dormice were no exception. Medieval herbalists and physicians sometimes recommended dormouse fat as a remedy for various ailments. It was believed to soothe joint pain and ear aches when applied externally. The idea of using animal fats for healing wasn't unusual. What's surprising is how widely dormouse fat appears in some medieval remedy manuscripts. Some recipes even combined dormouse fat with herbs like rosemary or lavender to create salves that promised relief and comfort. Beyond fat, dormice were thought to embody qualities linked to vitality and warmth, perhaps because they hibernated through the cold months and re-emerged in spring. This cyclical behavior was metaphorically attractive for medieval healers, who valued natural rhythms and seasonal signs when diagnosing and treating illnesses. Eating dormouse meat, therefore, might have been seen as a way to internalize these qualities, warming the body or strengthening it for the challenges ahead. Historians still debate how seriously such medicinal claims were taken, or how widespread dormouse-based remedies actually were. Some scholars suggest these uses might have been more common in rural or monastic settings, where knowledge of local flora and fauna blended with folk traditions. Others argue that dormouse medicine was largely symbolic, with little real therapeutic effect, but significant cultural meaning. Interestingly, dormouse fat and meat sometimes appear in texts alongside other exotic remedies, like crushed pearls or powdered unicorn horn ingredients. We now know are more magical thinking than medicine. This mix of practical and fantastical treatments reflects the medieval blend of science, superstition, and hope. You might picture a medieval apothecary's workshop, filled with jars of herbs and animal fats, the air thick with fragrant smoke, where a carefully measured amount of dormouse fat is blended into a balm. The hands preparing the remedy work slowly and deliberately, aware of the symbolic power as much as the physical effects. So, as you imagine this quiet room and its slow rituals, dormice transform once again from feast to medicine, from animal to symbol, inviting you to ponder the overlapping worlds of healing, eating, and belief in the medieval imagination. You now step into the shadowy corners of medieval law and custom, where dormice surprisingly appear in regulations and social rules that might seem odd today, but made perfect sense back then. The legal status of dormice was a curious matter, tied to property rights, hunting laws, and even fines, offering a glimpse into how medieval society balanced resource use and social order. In some regions, dormice were considered valuable game, and hunting or farming them without permission could lead to fines or penalties. These laws were part of the larger medieval framework designed to protect certain animals for nobles or landowners, reinforcing social hierarchies. You might imagine a rustic village meeting where disputes over dormouse cages or hunting rights are settled with measured words and sharp glances, One quirky legal detail is that dormouse farming sometimes required licenses, especially on estates where the right to keep or hunt small game was carefully controlled. These licenses ensured that only authorized persons could maintain gliraria, preventing overexploitation and preserving the delicate balance of woodland resources. Historians still argue about how rigorously these laws were enforced or how common such licenses really were. Some records hint at lax enforcement in rural areas, while others show strict penalties, reflecting the patchwork nature of medieval legal systems. Dormice also appear in curious legal tales involving theft or damage. For example, cases where someone's gliraria was tampered with or dormice stolen could escalate into serious disputes, because these tiny creatures represented a tangible investment and potential profit. This legal attention highlights how important dormice were economically and culturally. They were not just odd snacks, but assets tied to livelihood and social status, reflecting broader medieval concerns about property and resource management. As you imagine the slow pace of medieval courts and village councils, dormice quietly take their place in the mix of laws and customs. Tiny players in the grand theater of medieval justice and everyday life, you drift into the quieter, less documented realms of medieval folklore and superstition, where dormice appear in stories and beliefs that may seem quaint or curious today. These tiny creatures inspired a surprising variety of tales, often highlighting their mysterious behavior and close connection to the natural world. A fitting reflection of the medieval fascination with animals as symbols and omens. One charming folk belief held that dormice could predict the weather. People noticed that when dormice emerged early from hibernation, a mild spring was on its way. A late awakening signaled a harsher season. This connection to the rhythms of nature gave dormice a subtle role as weather prophets, weaving them into the everyday lives and seasonal expectations of rural communities. There were also stories about dormice being guardians of the forest's secrets, small creatures with knowledge of hidden things. Some folk tales told of dormice leading lost travelers to safety, or warning of approaching danger with their soft squeaks and sudden movements. You might imagine a quiet woodland path where the faint rustle of leaves signals the presence of these elusive guides, their tiny eyes reflecting the dappled sunlight. Historians still debate how widespread these beliefs were, or whether they were limited to specific regions or social groups. Some argue that dormice folklore was part of a broader medieval tradition of attributing symbolic meaning to animals, while others suggest these tales might have been more localized, passed down through generations in rural villages. Interestingly, dormice also appear in medieval bestiaries, illustrated collections of animals with moral or spiritual lessons. In these texts, dormice were sometimes used to symbolize prudence or foresight, qualities admired in medieval Christian teachings. Their habit of storing food and retreating to safety lent itself well to these interpretations. You can almost hear a storyteller's gentle voice recounting these tales by firelight, weaving the dormouse's soft squeaks and quick scurries into a tapestry of mystery and meaning. These stories weren't just entertainment. They shaped how people understood the natural world and their place within it. So, as you settle deeper into this quiet world of folklore, dormice become tiny messengers from the past, carrying whispers of weather, wisdom, and woodland magic. A soothing reminder of the slow rhythms that once guided medieval life. You now wander into the world of medieval animal husbandry, where dormice occupy a surprisingly prominent niche, while their wild cousins scurried through forests. These tiny creatures were deliberately bred and fattened in specialized enclosures called gliraria. The process was part craft, part agricultural science, blending careful observation with a dose of patience and quiet care. The glirarium was usually a wooden or stone structure with multiple compartments, designed to keep dormice contained but comfortable. Inside, the environment mimicked woodland settings, with bedding of straw or leaves and food plentifully supplied. The goal was to fatten dormice to a luxurious size, sometimes 3 times their wild weight, before the next feast or market day. Interestingly, medieval dormouse farmers used ingenious feeding methods, offering a mix of nuts, chestnuts, acorns, and occasionally bread soaked in milk or wine. This careful diet was essential to produce the prized fat dormouse, which commanded a good price or guaranteed social cachet at banquets. Historians still argue whether dormouse farming was more common in urban centers or rural estates. Some evidence points to monasteries experimenting with gleraria as part of their self-sufficient economies, while other records indicate that noble households maintained dormice pens as status symbols and reliable food sources. A quirky detail involves the way dormice were sometimes transported alive in small baskets lined with soft cloth, ensuring they arrived fresh and plump at markets or noble tables. You can picture a medieval market scene, the bustle of traders, the scent of fresh bread mingling with the earthy aroma of live dormice in their cages. The practice of breeding and raising dormice demonstrates the medieval dedication to slow, methodical food preparation. No fast food here, just slow-growing delicacies that required attention and care. As you imagine the quiet routine of feeding and tending to these tiny animals, the picture emerges of a world where even the smallest creatures were part of a delicate balance of nature, economy, and culture, patiently nurtured to satisfy both appetite and tradition. You drift gently now into the culinary variations across medieval Europe, where dormouse dishes reveal regional quirks and local tastes that would surprise the modern palate. While the basics, roasting, stuffing, and serving with honey or herbs, were common, each area added its own subtle twists to the preparation, reflecting available ingredients and cultural preferences. In Italy, for example, dormice were sometimes dipped in a sweet wine reduction, enhancing their natural sweetness with a delicate syrupiness. Tuscan recipes suggest stuffing dormice with pine nuts and raisins, creating a blend of textures and flavors that hints at the Renaissance's early love of complex combinations. You might imagine a dimly lit Italian kitchen, the air fragrant with wine and herbs, as a cook carefully prepares this small, elegant dish. Further north, in the forests of Germany and Bohemia, dormice were often served alongside rich mushroom sauces or nestled in hearty bread puddings. These heartier accompaniments suited the cooler climate and denser forest produce, emphasizing warmth and comfort over sweetness. The contrast between the tender dormouse meat and the earthy mushrooms must have been a quietly satisfying experience. Meanwhile, in England, dormice sometimes appeared in pies or pasties, mixed with spices like cinnamon and clove that were rare and precious imports. These spices added an exotic flair, a whisper of distant lands that brought a gentle excitement to otherwise familiar meals. It's easy to picture a medieval English manor, with servants carefully carrying steaming pies filled with spiced dormouse meat to the great hall. Historians still debate how widespread these regional recipes were, and whether certain dormouse dishes were reserved for special occasions or everyday consumption. Some scholars argue that local tastes strongly influenced dormouse preparations, while others suggest a shared culinary culture spread across aristocratic Europe. A quirky culinary tidbit is that in some places, dormice were glazed with sugar or honey and lightly toasted, creating a sweet and savory snack that sounds oddly like an ancient precursor to candied nuts. Imagine nibbling on these glazed dormice by candlelight, a little sweet treat to end a long day. So as you drift through these regional kitchens, dormice reveal themselves as adaptable delicacies, quietly absorbing the flavors and traditions of the lands they inhabited. A gentle reminder that medieval cuisine was far from uniform, shaped by slow tastes and local whispers. You now drift into the quieter world of medieval social customs surrounding eating dormice, those subtle, often unspoken rules that governed who ate what, When and how, while dormice were a delicacy, their consumption was wrapped in etiquette and meaning, reflecting the complex dance of medieval hospitality and hierarchy. At grand banquets, dormice were often served early in the meal, sometimes as a delicate starter or part of the second course. This placement signaled their special status, neither humble nor overly extravagant, but a refined pleasure for guests with discerning tastes. You can almost hear the soft murmurs of approval as these tiny creatures make their rounds, passed gently on silver platters. The manner of eating dormice was also particular. Diners might use small forks or even their fingers to savor the tender meat, careful not to break the dainty form. It was less about practicality and more about ritual, a way to demonstrate grace and appreciation for the host's generosity. Interestingly, dormice consumption was sometimes restricted by gender or social rank. Some records suggest that women and children were less likely to be served dormice, possibly because the delicacy was reserved for male guests or heads of household. Of course, these customs varied widely by region and social context, adding layers of nuance to the dormouse's role at the table. Historians still debate how rigid these social codes were, and whether exceptions were common during festivals or informal gatherings. Some believe that the strict rules were more ideal than practice, with many families simply enjoying dormice as part of their seasonal meals without much fuss. A quirky note: in some households, dormouse dishes were considered a topic of conversation starters or even lighthearted teasing. Guests might comment on the dormouse's size or the sweetness of its meat, engaging in gentle banter that eased social tensions and encouraged camaraderie. So, as you settle into this softly lit dining hall, dormice become more than food. They are part of a social choreography, a small but meaningful thread in the fabric of medieval human connection. Enjoyed slowly and with quiet appreciation, you drift into the often overlooked environmental context of dormouse consumption, how medieval attitudes toward wildlife and habitat influence the practice of eating these tiny creatures. The balance between using natural resources and preserving the forest's health was delicate, and dormice occupied an interesting place in this relationship. Medieval people understood, to some extent, the importance of sustainable hunting and farming. Gleraria. Those specialized dormouse enclosures allowed for controlled breeding rather than wild capture, showing early efforts to manage populations responsibly. This practice reflects a cautious respect for nature's limits, even if framed within the era's practical needs. You might imagine the quiet woods where dormice roamed freely, alongside other game and plants vital to local communities. Their presence was a sign of a healthy ecosystem, and over-harvesting could threaten this balance. Some medieval regulations aimed to prevent such depletion, tying dormouse farming into broader forest management policies. Interestingly, dormice themselves contributed to the woodland environment by dispersing seeds as they foraged, aiding forest regeneration. This ecological role, while unrecognized at the time, highlights the interconnectedness of human and natural worlds, a web of relationships that medieval people experienced through observation and tradition. Historians still debate how conscious medieval people were of these ecological effects. Some argue that sustainable practices were driven more by necessity than environmental awareness, while others see an early form of stewardship emerging from lived experience. A quirky aside, dormice's habit of nesting in hollow trees sometimes intersected with human activities like timber harvesting, leading to practical conflicts or accommodations. Imagine a forester pausing to check a tree hollow, curious whether dormice have taken residence, balancing economic needs with respect for nature's tiny tenants. As you breathe in this slow rhythm of forest life and human care, dormice stand as gentle symbols of the medieval world's complex, often subtle relationship with the environment, one of use, respect, and quiet coexistence. you find yourself immersed in the realm of medieval literature and art, where dormice make surprisingly frequent and whimsical appearances. These small creatures were not only culinary treats, but also charming symbols and characters in stories, illuminated manuscripts, and tapestries, reflecting how deeply they were woven into the fabric of medieval culture. Dormice often appear in medieval bestiaries not just as biological specimens, but as allegorical figures embodying traits like caution, thrift, or even laziness. Their habit of hibernation lent itself beautifully to moral lessons on prudence and preparation, themes popular in monastic and scholarly circles. You might picture an illuminated manuscript page, richly colored with gold leaf, where a dormouse nestles amid leaves, its tiny face turned toward the reader as if to share a secret. In poetry and fables, dormice sometimes served as comic relief or gentle reminders of everyday life's small pleasures and perils. Their squeaky voices and soft movements lent themselves to stories that were both amusing and reflective, perfect for a quiet evening's reading or recital. One particularly quirky example is a 14th century English poem where a dormouse is humorously portrayed as a glutton, dreaming of endless feasts, a playful twist given their real-life role as a delicacy. Such literary use highlights the medieval love of blending reality and fantasy, humor and moralizing. Historians still debate whether these artistic representations influenced dormice's culinary popularity or simply reflected it. Some suggest that the animal's frequent appearance in art helped elevate its status at the table, while others think the food culture naturally inspired its artistic presence. You can almost hear the soft turning of vellum pages and the hushed voices of monks or scribes, carefully illustrating these tiny creatures with delicate strokes, their work both an act of devotion and a celebration of the world around them. So, as you drift through this gallery of medieval creativity, dormice reveal themselves as more than mere snacks. They are cultural icons, playful muses, and symbols of the quietly intricate medieval imagination. You glide now toward the quieter moments of dormice's decline in medieval cuisine, tracing the subtle shifts that led to this once popular delicacy fading from the banquet tables of later centuries. Changes in taste, social structures, and the rise of new foods all played their part in gently pushing dormice out of the spotlight. By the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, culinary fashions began to evolve. The growing influence of global trade introduced exotic spices, fruits, and meats, broadening the palate and reshaping what was considered fashionable fare. Dormice, with their distinctly regional appeal, started to seem quaint, even old-fashioned, as diners sought newer, flashier tastes. Social changes also played a role. The rise of centralized monarchies and more formalized court cultures brought standardized menus and grander presentations, often favoring larger game or more elaborate dishes. Dormice, small and intimate, fit less neatly into these evolving spectacles. Yet dormice did not disappear overnight. Records show their continued presence in rural areas and among certain communities where traditions held strong. Their gentle flavor and easy farming made them a reliable, if modest, source of protein. Even as grander dishes took center stage, historians still debate the precise reasons and timelines for dormice's culinary decline. Some point to economic shifts and the increased availability of other meats, while others highlight changing social attitudes towards small game. It's likely a combination of these factors gently nudged dormice toward obscurity. A quirky postscript. In some folk traditions, dormice lingered as symbolic reminders of a bygone era, their image preserved in tales, festivals, and occasional recipes passed down through families. They became tiny culinary ghosts, whispers of slower, quieter times as you settle back from this journey.